I'm here. Thank you, Christine. So today, myself and Charlie Wilson are going to be presenting about the Murray River, the Restoring Murray Woodlands Biodiversity and Carbon Tender. Both Charlie and I are with the New South Wales Biodiversity Conservation Trust. We are a statutory government department, and our remit's all around private land conservation and protecting and enhancing native vegetation. So this tender is pretty much just all about that, and it's being carried out in part of the Murray-Alice region, and a large part of it is on Wiradjuri country. And I would like to acknowledge that the country we're all meeting on today and that this tender is held on and I'd like to acknowledge that it is being held on. We're meeting on virtual lands, and this tender will be held on the lands of Aboriginal people. And I'd like to pay my respects to the traditional custodians of this country, and recognise their ongoing connection to the land, water, and culture. And I'd like to pay my respects to the elders past, present, and emerging. And I'd like to extend that respect to any Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people joining us today. So this tender, it's all about trying to protect and restore some threatened woodland communities of the Murray region. These communities that we'll be talking about a bit further on are on some of the prime agricultural land in New South Wales, and as such they've been heavily cleared and degraded, and just protecting the small remnants isn't enough. We need to actually expand them and try and return some of the missing species, expand the woodland areas, and try and connect them as best as possible. And this is the aim of this tender. So this tenders, so this presentation is sort of going to delve into that, and how we're going to achieve this expansion of these areas is through a carbon agreement with the Clean Energy Regulator. This is quite a new. This is very new for the Biodiversity Conservation Trust. This is the first time we're running a carbon and a biodiversity tender. So it's a bit of a lesson for everyone, but we're really enthusiastic. We've had really good support from the Clean Energy Regulator, and it's unfortunately they're unable to be here this afternoon. So this presentation, we're going to initially just talk about what funding is available, what a conservation tender is, what it looks like, how you participate, what an agreement is, and what a carbon agreement is. We're going to talk a bit about the eligibility for this tender. Please bear in mind that this is quite a high-level presentation. For more details, we do have this landholder guide. It is on our website, and this is essentially the Bible. So please, if you are interested and you meet the eligibility that we talk about today, and you have some property in the tender area, put in an EOI and check out our landholder guide. We'll go through the timeline, how the tender will unfold. Then I'll throw to Charlie, who will talk about the carbon project and how that works. So he's got some information about how you can estimate your carbon credits, and then what role the Clean Energy Regulator plays, and the exact carbon project method that we'll be using. And then I'll provide a bit of a case study to try and tie it all together, and then we'll go through some questions at the end. Just quickly, I mentioned the eligibility and being within the tender area. This is a map of our tender area. It's quite a large area, and we've got it quite big to try and capture as many examples of these threatened woodland communities as possible. You'll notice at the bottom of this picture, there's a little note saying that this map can be found on our landholder guide on page 9. And we've tried to carry that through, just pointing out where in the landholder guide different sections are for you to refer to. You play along if you like. but there's also a web app that you can view this this map on as well. One of the first questions we get asked whenever we have a tender is how much money is available. And the short answer is that we don't actually have a set budget for this tender. There is a bucket of funding for the financial year. For this financial year, it's $45 million, but this covers 4 funded tender programs across New South Wales, including this one. And for each program, we look at best value for money. It is a tender. We are after the best value for money. So the funding isn't evenly split between those 4 programs. This is the 4th tender that has been run in New South Wales by the BCT, and this is the 20th that we've run in the New South Wales and the 4th in the Murray Riverina region. The previous outcomes from other tenders can be found on that webpage that's there on the screen. If you want to have a look at what's happened in previous tenders, the funding that once a bid is successful, the funding that is available, or the funding that's required to meet the management needs of that agreement, is placed into a managed fund, and the interest from that managed fund is then what contributes to ongoing in perpetuity payments that are needed for this tender. We've also set aside funding in this case to pay for Murray local seed services to undertake the carbon plantings, the initial plantings in the carbon planting area. But I'll talk more about that a bit later on. So first of all, what is a conservation tender? And it's a bit like any other tender. In our case, it works on a reverse auction process where the landholder sets their own price, their bid, and that bid is around managing remnant native vegetation patches on their property. And this management is primarily around weed, pest, grazing, sort of management actions. The difference with this tender is that we're also looking to fund the maintenance of a carbon project area beyond the carbon crediting period, which is a key distinction. As I mentioned, it is a tender. We are after value for money. In this case, we are after the biodiversity value of a property, and then that value is assessed by the Biodiversity Conservation Trust during a site visit, and then that score, biodiversity score, is then divided by the bid price, and that's how we calculate value for money. That biodiversity value is generated through our metric, and we do have a document on our website that goes into more detail about that biodiversity metric. Those bids that are successful are then offered an agreement and on the proviso that the landholder enters into a carbon project as well, and then that agreement has ongoing funding attached to it. All right, so what is an agreement? Well, a conservation agreement is it's an untitled covenant that protects the biodiversity under that covenant area. In this tender, we're only offering in perpetuity conservation agreements. So that is, they are ongoing. They will transfer to all future landholders, and the funding that is attached to this agreement will also transfer to future landholders and will be in perpetuity, and that will be achieved through the interest earned on that managed fund. A conservation agreement contains a management plan, and this management plan is a negotiated plan between the Biodiversity Conservation Trust and the landholder around the management of the conservation area, and it primarily focuses on weed management, feral animal management, management of stock grazing, or total grazing pressure, and as well as the management and planting of carbon project area or any revegetation components to that. As I mentioned before, there is a carbon project proportion portion of this this tender. It is a separate agreement with the Clean Energy Regulator, but the Biodiversity Conservation Trust is going to be strongly supporting this. The Clean Energy Regulator is also supporting this, and the and the landholder will be as ably assisted throughout the process to register a carbon agreement and to meet their obligations. With this carbon agreement, the whilst the Biodiversity Conservation Trust will assist in setting it up and working out the planting densities and the planting species, and with Murray Seed Services, Murray Seed Services, and paying for those initial carbon plantings, the trees and shrubs in the ground, it will be up to the landholder to manage the carbon project area for that 25-year period. On the screen, I do have a hypothetical of what a conservation agreement and a carbon project agreement would look like. The carbon project sits underneath the conservation agreement and has a conservation agreement going around it. And then, as I mentioned before, it is an in perpetuity agreement, so those carbon planting areas will be managed and protected in perpetuity, and the funding will also be in perpetuity. Consider it fireproof, drought-proof, flood-proof funding, as long as the management actions are continued. Eligibility. There is a bit of detail in the eligibility section. I am going to keep it quite high level and just touch on the key eligibility criteria. For more details, please check out the Landholder Guide. As mentioned before, there's two agreements, one with the Clean Energy Regulator and one with the Biodiversity Conservation Trust. And the first lot of criteria around the applicant and their eligibility. For both the Biodiversity Conservation Trust and the Clean Energy Regulator, we require the applicant to be the owners of the land and to be an Australian citizen or a company that's registered in Australia for tax purposes. We also need the applicant to be willing to enter into an in perpetuity conservation agreement and also willing to register a carbon project with the Clean Energy Regulator. An additional key eligibility criteria from the Clean Energy Regulator is that the applicant needs to have the right to obtain and hold those Australian carbon credit units. The second lot of eligibility criteria around the site. So for the Biodiversity Conservation Trust, the proposed conservation area and carbon area need to be within the tender area. It has to be freehold land, and it needs to cover an area that's at least 20 hectares. Of this 20 hectares, at least 5 hectares needs to be of one of these threatened woodlands. And then there also needs to be a carbon project area that is at least 5 hectares as well. This carbon project area can't be more than 3 times the area of the threatened woodland, and it can't exceed 50 hectares. And we'll touch on that a bit further later on as well. For the Clean Energy Regulator, the carbon project the area must have been clear of forest for at least the last 5 years prior to the date of application, and doesn't need to be cleared for planting to occur. So, for example, you can't need to clear any invasive native scrub or anything to plant it out. So it's kind of like you can't need to clear carbon to plant carbon philosophy. The another thing to remember for the Clean Energy Regulator is that there can't have been any work started for planting, can't be any site preparation or anything occurring before the project's actually registered with the Clean Energy Regulator. Now, I've mentioned a few times these threatened woodlands that we're targeting, and these are the 3 sort of communities that we're really aiming to protect, extend, and restore: grassy box woodlands, sandhill pine woodlands, and inland grey box woodlands. The Sandhill Pine Woodlands is quite a broad community that we're targeting here. It includes Bull Oak Woodlands as well as Sandhill Pine Woodlands. So the Sandhill Dunes, prior streams, it is quite broad. So if you do have any bull oak or anything like that, or some scattered pines, or anything that's you think might be fit that definition, please get in touch. As this has quite a restore component to it, this tender, whilst we would love to have best examples of these communities being submitted, or expression of interest being submitted for really brilliant patches, we recognise that a lot of these patches have been fragmented and are quite heavily degraded. So even an area of grey box, which is just a grey box and a bit of a weedy understory, that would be eligible for this tender. Just because of how important these small areas are. So just to give you an idea of where these communities are in the tender area, this map gives a bit of an example. The maroon kind of colour in the eastern side, sort of Culcan west to Holbrook, is where we mostly find the grassy box woodlands. These then grade into the grey box, inland grey box community, right across past Deniliquin, and then Sandhill Pine Woodlands are kind of scattered around the area. And on our tool for assisting anyone who's interested to see if they're eligible, if they may or may not have these woodlands, we do have some mapping around this on our website. That light green color, it's a bit tricky to see on a presentation screen. That's a bit of the indicative mapping of these woodlands. It's just indicative. It's not not hard and fast. It's just to give us some guidance. If you do think you have some of these woodland communities on your property and you're interested, take a photo, and it's not mapped, take a photo and send it in. And conversely, you might have something shown as being mapped, but it's not. But if you want to check, send us in a picture, and we can see our best. I'd now like to introduce Charlie. He's our carbon market specialist with the Biodiversity Conservation Trust. Charlie's going to go through the tender timeline and talk a bit more about the carbon side of this tender. Thanks, Charlie.
Cheers. Thanks so much, Stu. Just jump to the next slide. Isn't it? There we go. Great. So I think just the first point I want to make here is that the tender is a long process, so there is time to understand and what is quite a complex process, combining our conservation agreement with this CER carbon project. So really a really important point is that you haven't committed to anything until you actually register that carbon project with the Clean Energy Regulator and sign a conservation agreement with us. And that's not going to be until December 2023 or even early next year that successful bidders will be known, and then you'll need to register those projects and sign that agreement. So in between now and then, should you want to participate, we'll work with you to make sure that you really understand obligations, to develop the management plans, to develop the planting scenarios, to make sure that you've got all the documentation correct for submitting your carbon project. And really, yeah, it's not until the end of the year that you would actually even be committing to anything. So basically, there is one really important date, though, which is that you need to submit an EOI by the 24th of February to participate. And that, again, it's just a really simple document with just basically your name, your email address, and your signature that you're willing for us to continue to talk to you and continue to participate in this process. You can withdraw it at any time, but we do need to have those EOIs in before we're then actually able to continue talking to you. So that EOI period closes on the 24th of Feb. We will then look at all of those EOIs that come in, and in March we'll contact you and we'll just ask you to identify where that conservation agreement and carbon planting area might be on your property. This can change. It's just an early indication that's useful, and just, an indicative desktop look at, kind of what you're thinking and how this may fit on your property. We'll then look at all of those EOIs for eligibility, and then we'll look, and we'll rank them and make sure, you're in the project area, all of the simple stuff like that. And then we'll look to come out to your site in around about April or May. And we'll really, that's really to do further on-ground checks, look at vegetation, undertake biodiversity assessments, etc. In June and July, we'll then be working with you to really nut down and prepare those conservation plans and define where the carbon project areas are going to be. And we'll do that in collaboration with landholders, and then also including advice from Murray Seed Services, as Stu has mentioned. So we'll really try and tailor those revegetation plans specifically to the sites where these projects might be, to make sure that they're in fitting with the remnant vegetation, but also so that they're eligible for the carbon project too. After we finalise these areas and the conservation management plans are finalised, basically we give it back to you as a, hopefully it's got everything in there from what you need to submit for the carbon project through to all the information about the management actions and the defined areas. And then what you'll do is submit your bid in August back to us. So that's how much you want to be paid for this particular project on your property. Those bids are then assessed and ranked by a panel within the BCT, and the panel makes a recommendation to our board in December. So really we'd know around about December who the successful bidders would be, and then it's only at this point, should you wish to proceed, that you would then need to register your carbon project with the Clean Energy Regulator and then sign a conservation agreement with us. So right up until that point, you still haven't committed to anything. We recognise that circumstances can change. Even if we've been through that process with you and you decide to not continue, obviously we'd love you to, but it's that, that's still okay at that stage. So once you've registered your carbon project and you've signed your conservation agreement with us, you'll basically be ready to start receiving your first payments from around about March 24 onwards for the remnant vegetation. Then the first environmental plantings would probably likely occur around about autumn 2024. Now, again, that's flexible. We recognise that, conditions can change. It might not be ideal. We have contingencies worked in to be able to move those around. But then typically you would be eligible to start earning your first Australian carbon credit units. Typically within the first 6 months to the first 5 years. Generally, you wouldn't put in a report for those units within 6 months. You wouldn't have generated a huge amount, but you must put in a report within 5 years. And again, Clean Energy Regulator with this particular program works directly with landholders to make sure that they know how to submit those reports and assist them with mapping, etc. Jump to next slide, Stu. So how does the carbon project work within this tender? Typically, in the past, BCT has really focused on remnant veg with these conservation tenders. So really just protecting existing good to moderate condition remnant vegetation. What we're really looking to do here is use the carbon project as a revegetation method to really expand and enhance on these fragmented and degraded pieces of vegetation in this landscape. So we're really looking to see if this is another mechanism that the BCT can use in order to really enhance and improve and deliver restoration outcomes rather than just protecting remnant veg. And with the added bonus that landholders then also receive additional income from the carbon markets. So in the first scenario here, you have what we sort of, and again, these are just examples. It's just to give you a bit of an idea of how we think it could potentially work on properties. The first is this expanding example. You have a piece of intact remnant veg, one large parcel, it's over 5 hectares, meets that eligibility requirement, and then you put the environmental planting just coming out off that, and it's really just about expanding that, and that would, essentially go out and meet your eligibility requirements in terms of size. The second is this enhancing scenario where you might have say a piece of remnant vegetation that's not in that good quality condition. It might have large parcels that are missing within it, but each one of those parcels doesn't add up to 5 hectares, isn't 5 hectares, but altogether they add up to 5 hectares to deliver that eligibility requirement. So you're really enhancing that piece of remnant vegetation that exists. Conversely, you could flip this on its head, and the blue areas could be the remnant parcels, each less than 5 hectares by themselves, but add up to 5 hectares to meet that eligibility criteria of 5 hectares of remnant veg. And then you put the environmental planting all around it to really enhance and buffer that existing remnant vegetation. And finally, this sort of connecting scenario that we're sort of thinking could work in this landscape is you may have a larger in-piece belt of remnant vegetation of the target threatened ecological communities, and then it could be a paper road, for instance, and then you basically put a belt planting in that connects it over to another piece of remnant vegetation on your property, and that may be some other revegetation work that you've already undertaken. It could be a riparian area that you fenced off and protected, but really in this scenario it would be advantageous because it's really delivering those connectivity outcomes within the landscape. And again, we'll be collaborating with Murray Seed Services to really help design these planting works so that they deliver the best biodiversity outcomes. So with this particular carbon project, we're delivering the project through what's called the Environmental Plantings Pilot. And this is a scheme that exists under the Emissions Reduction Fund and uses the environmental plantings methodology. And basically, the reason we're doing this is it's one of the easiest ways for landholders to participate in carbon projects. So it's really about incentivizing landholders to be able to directly engage with the carbon project, an environmental plantings carbon project, without having to go through a carbon service provider. And the Clean Energy Regulator, who is the federal government statutory authority that basically oversees Australia's carbon market, basically they will work directly with landholders to assist them to deliver this pilot program. And basically what that means is it simplifies the project registration. There's no project registration costs, which can be quite significant if you're just doing standard carbon projects. And there's also a really simplified crediting process. So basically the Clean Energy Regulator will work with you, you submit your management reports, and then they model and estimate how many ACCUs you've generated. It's not onerous, it doesn't require you to do on-ground sampling, etc. It's a modeled outcome. And then the really big one is it removes the costs of project audits. So there's a requirement under typical carbon projects to have an audit every 5 years. To have 3 audits within the crediting period, which crediting period is 25 years. And these can be really, really significant and expensive. They require a third party to undertake them. And then the process of actually submitting the report to the Clean Energy Regulator is costly. Don't have to do that in this project. The Clean Energy Regulator will do all of that remotely using remote sensing, and together with your reports where you submit your management actions and potentially some ground truth photos, and that's it. So it really is a fantastic and easy way to sort of engage or dip your toe in the carbon market through this environmental plantings pilot. And there's much more information about that on the Clean Energy Regulator's website. So what are environmental plantings carbon projects? Basically, they're just a mixture of native, local tree, shrub and understory species that establish a new and permanent forest cover. So what is a permanent forest cover? It's trees and shrubs that can achieve a height of over 2 meters. So that's the forest potential. And that the crown cover covers at least 0.2 of a hectare. So they don't have to be monocultures of just straight run lines. You can have patches, and there's just a range of conditions to make sure that you're actually getting that 0.2 of a hectare of crown cover within your environmental plantings carbon project area. And then from there, basically you earn 1 Australian carbon credit unit for every tonne of carbon dioxide that's stored in the trees. So it's just the trees in this particular project. So the woody biomass doesn't include soil carbon pools. And basically the way that is done is that there is what's called the FullCam carbon accounting model. It's an old forestry model that's being utilised in this instance, and it estimates the growth of the trees based on the stem densities, planting configurations, soil type, climate information, etc. And it just models basically how much carbon you get in there. So the idea here is that it really simplifies the process of understanding how many credits you're earning. You don't waste a lot of money going on ground and having to measure tree densities and deep, diameter at breast height, etc. So it's about getting that trade-off about simple estimation and conservative estimation of the carbon credits that you're generating. So there are a number of permanence obligations that are required both under our conservation agreement and with the Clean Energy Regulator's environmental plantings pilot projects. So first of all, if you were just to undertake an environmental plantings pilot carbon project by itself, you can set either a 25-year or a 100-year permanence period. So the 25-year period is aligned with the crediting period. So the crediting period is the time that you can earn ACCUs. So you could have a 25-year crediting period and then your permanence period ends at 25 years. Or you can set a 100-year permanence period. Now, a 100-year permanence, all carbon projects have a 5% reduction on the ACCUs that you generate during the lifetime of that project. And that 5% goes into a national buffer pool, basically just as an insurance policy for all of the carbon projects in case there are some reversals. If you set a 25-year permanence period, there's a further 25 to 20% reduction. So an overall a 25% reduction on the number of carbon credits that you can generate. Now, because we're requiring an in perpetuity agreement to go over the top of the carbon project, basically there's no point in setting a 25-year permanence period. That would just be throwing away 20% of the ACCUs. So one of the key eligibility criteria for this project from the BCT's perspective is that you set that 100-year permanence period. So how can you estimate how many Australian carbon credit units you generate from this project? So CSIRO has developed what's called the Landscape Options and Opportunities for Carbon Abatement Calculator. That shortens down to LOOC-C. And basically, it's just a really quick desktop tool to assess how many carbon credits you could potentially earn from a range of methodologies that exist under the Clean Energy Regulator's Emissions Reduction Fund. Basically, you just draw a map, a little map, as you can see here, on your property where you may think that you'd like to run the carbon project. You answer a few tick box questions, and it will then tell you the total number of ACCUs that you can generate during that 25-year crediting period, but then also the tonnes per hectare of CO2 equivalent or credits per hectare that you can generate per annum. That address there on your screen, it's also in the landholder guide. If you want to go and have a look at that tool. Again, it's just a desktop estimate and it doesn't include any of those reductions in ACCUs that I mentioned earlier. So what can you do with them? The first option is to participate in what's called the Emissions Reductions Fund reverse auction. This is the major scheme that the federal government uses to purchase ACCUs in order to meet our international obligations. Basically, they run 2 reverse auctions every year, and you put in one confidential bid into that, during the auction window. And typically, the lower price bids are the ones that receive the ACCUs. So it's a reverse auction system. This is typically used by the bigger service providers and probably not one of the better options that would be used for these, smaller scale direct landholder projects. Another option that is currently being developed is selling to the Australian government through what's called the Powering the Regions Fund. Now, we're not entirely sure what this is going to look like, but at the moment, what it is kind of looking like is it's an option for smaller scale projects to just directly sell to the government at a set price that could either have been determined by the last ERF auction or some other mechanism. So really this would be more aligned to this sorts of projects. Projects typically under about 200 hectares may be able to participate in this, but again, we wait and see what that looks like. The third option is basically to sell on the secondary market to private buyers. And this could just be companies that are looking to meet their net zero obligations voluntarily, or even just ESG commitments, or start to bank carbon credits into the future. Typically on the secondary market, the price of ACCUs goes for a significantly higher price than what you get through the ERF reverse auction. And there is a website, accus.com.au, that lists basically what the current spot price is. Another thing to note as well, though, is that that is the average price across all of the different types of carbon credit units that are generated. The types of units that we're generating here with the environmental plantings pilot project, and something that we really want to test, is that because there are significant co-benefits attached to these carbon credit units, they tend to trade at a much higher price than, say, just a typical avoided emissions carbon credit unit. And that's really something that we are hoping to test with this particular project. That does our conservation agreement with the design of these biodiverse plantings that are really enhancing remnant vegetation, will the secondary market value that more than just another typical ACCU? And with that in mind, we've actually collaborated with Telstra, who have made an undertaking that they will put an offer of purchase to any landholder who participates in this program to purchase their ACCUs off them for the entire 25 years of the crediting period. So an upfront contract to it with a commitment to do that. You don't have to undertake that. It's just it's a commitment from Telstra and an offer that's there should landholders want to do that and secure it. And the price of the ACCUs would be negotiated between the landholder and Telstra. It's not something that the BCT would get involved in. And then finally, you can hold on to them. So you could use them and retire them to meet your own emissions reduction goals, or you can just bank them and hang on to them and see potentially where the price goes. So I'll throw back to Stu now, and he's just going to give a bit of a case study about what this might look like in real life on ground, and try and bring some of these themes together.
All right, thanks very much for that, Charlie. Yeah, so just a little bit of a hypothetical case study with the aim of trying to wrap it all together, and hopefully it all makes sense to everyone. So for this example, our hypothetical landholder has a property and they're inside the tender area, and they knew that in the southwest corner of their property they had some grey box, so they put in an EOI and were selected for a site visit, and so which would be sort of in April, May this year. And so one of the BCT staff members went out and identified that yes, they had a 4-hectare patch of grey box, and alongside, just south of it, there was another hectare of paddock trees, another hectare's worth of paddock trees, which gave them the 5 hectares and meant that they were eligible for the tender and could proceed. There was then a lot of discussion about how where the carbon plantings would go and what options the landholder wanted to explore. They could hypothetically do 15 hectares of grey box carbon plantings adjoining that area and have a 20-hectare conservation agreement, and that would be eligible and that would be great. For this scenario, they decided that they would just have a 5-hectare carbon planting of inland grey box adjoining that area, and the landholder was also particularly keen to have a shelter belt down the western side of their property, and also revegetate an existing creek line. They thought this was going to give them biosecurity benefits, as well as some connectivity, and encourage some and provide shelter for stock and encourage some small birds to journey across the property. Pollination services, all sorts of different functions could be enhanced. These 2 carbon plantings in the existing 5 hectares were still leaving them a bit short, but they had this creek line on the eastern side of the property that they were very keen on protecting. They'd done a lot of work weeding it and had done some revegetation in the past. So that made sense for that area to be included in the conservation or the project area. Because of the way that the fence lines worked out, it made sense to fence off some remnant poor performing paddock space that then formed another carbon planting or several carbon planting spots, but this time of river red gum to match that creek line community. So the total project area came to 30 hectares. They had the 5 hectares of threatened ecological community, the TC, apologies for another acronym. And they had 15 hectares, which was of carbon plantings, which was 5 times the amount of the threatened ecological community. And then they had the 10 hectares of river red gum forest. So this meant that they were eligible, and that and during the site visit and from ongoing conversations, there was, negotiation and discussion about what sort of management would be required, where new fencing would be needed, what grazing management regimes would look like, and what the carbon plantings would look like, and how Murray Seed Services would be involved. And they quite likely were on site during one of the site visits, or during the site visit, apologies. Once a management plan had been agreed on, both parties are satisfied, the landholders then given a final management plan along with the bid forms and bid packages, and the landholder would then bid on funding for the carbon project area and funding for the remnant vegetation area. So in year 1, the BCT would fund fencing and the tree planting on the carbon project area. In this case, the BCT would be funding the landholders to do the fencing and the Murray Seed Services to do the tree planting. In the carbon project area, from years 1 to 25, whilst the landholder is eligible to receive those Australian carbon credit units, those ACCUs, the BCT can't make any management payments for that carbon project area. From years 26 onwards, though, the landholder will receive an annual management payment from the BCT that the landholder nominates as being the payment they need to maintain those that carbon planting area and over its in perpetuity. Sorry. For the remnant vegetation area, the annual payments from the Biodiversity Conservation Trust would start almost as soon as the agreement's signed, and those would continue in perpetuity, not affected by rain, flood, hail, fire, and purely reliant on the management actions being continued for the next lot of payments being made. We do have a 5-year review process for our conservation agreements, where it is a negotiated review and can be initiated by the landholder, but it is a negotiated review. So the bid, as Charlie mentioned, the bid period would be sort of July, and then successful bids would be notified sort of December, and the process would go from there. So sort of just to quickly summarize, this tender, the aim of this tender is to protect and increase the area of those 3 threatened woodland communities, the grassy box woodland, sandhill pine woodland communities, and inland grey box communities. To do this, we're going to use the environmental plantings pilot method to plant out and extend those woodlands. The BCT will put a conservation agreement together with a management plan through negotiation with the landholder. The BCT will work with Murray Seed Services and the landholder to work out the planting mix for the carbon project area. It is a tender, so the landholder would set the price in their bids, and if successful, the landholder would register their carbon project with the Clean Energy Regulator, and then receive a conservation agreement and start work. If you are an eligible applicant and you think you might have an eligible site in the tender area, please submit an expression of interest form. As Charlie mentioned, there's no obligations attached to it. It is available on our website, and I'll put the link to that in the chat shortly. Grab a copy of the landholder guide from our website as well if you'd like to get a more detailed understanding of how it all works. So thank you everyone for coming this afternoon. It's very much appreciated, and if anyone has any questions, I think please raise your hands.
I think we've got a few in the chat here. We might just stop the recording.